This is Future Fork, a show that explores the world of food and the decisions we can make today that will shape our future. On the show, you'll hear from innovators in the food space. We'll have disruptive conversations with people from around the globe who are taking the lead on topics like food sustainability, ending world hunger, food security, and so much more. I'm your host, Paul Newnham. In this episode, we're talking to Anna Taylor, Executive Director of the Food Foundation. Anna is a distinguished nutritionist who was awarded an OBE for her work addressing global undernutrition. She's been at the forefront of developing sustainable food policy solutions for Britain. We'll be diving deep into the critical issues of food security and nutrition policy in the UK today. You'll hear about her journey from international development to leading the Food Foundation, her insights on creating effective food policies for low-income communities, and her vision for a more equitable food system in Britain. Let's get into it. Anna, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. Nice to be here.
So let's start out. I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey into nutrition policy. What drew you to this field initially?
Well, actually, that was, I think, what first got me interested in the wider world, really, was seeing the Band-Aid Ethiopian famine and how that was reported on the news, the famous sort of Michael Burke report, and the response to that. I was 14, I think, at the time, and that kind of first got me interested in international development, I suppose, and then so came into nutrition through that route, did a master's, ended up volunteering, and then my first sort of proper job was with UNICEF doing some research, and spent most of my career in that world. Started in sort of more humanitarian side and then moved into longer term nutrition programming and then more policy and advocacy work latterly. 10 years at Save the Children, then moved to DFID, as was the Department for International Development here in the UK, and then at 10 years ago did a big switch to focus on the UK, which has been super interesting, and there's a lot going on here on the food agenda.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about how your experiences, because it was a pretty amazing career and experience in the international space, I guess. How did that shape the way that you kind of came to the Food Foundation?
Basically, I had a kind of grounding in what kids need to be fed in order to thrive, in order to do well in school. And that sort of foundation applies whether you're here in Britain or you're in Sudan or wherever you are. Obviously, those contexts are massively different. But I think what that sort of grounding, particularly in Save the Children, taught me was about the sort of role of household economics, the role of health systems, how people kind of interact with their environment, and to the extent to which they actually enable children ultimately to eat well or not. And so a lot of that, those same basic principles apply here in the UK, even though we have very different contexts and different outcomes of some of those contexts as well in health terms. But I think what I was very fortunate to be exposed to in my latter years at Save the Children, and certainly during my time at DFID, was the role of the international community in either supporting or not action in this area. And that helped me to kind of really understand a bit more about politics and sort of policy making at the international level, but also in the domestic sphere, and how you can make change happen on a big scale through engaging with those processes and bringing the right evidence to the people that have the power to make decisions.
And so the focus from international to the UK, Britain, how did that kind of come about for you? Like, what was the motivation there?
Well, I'd been working on the international level for some time. It was a period at DFID where the UK had the presidency of the G8, we had the end of the London Olympics, and in both of those moments, the UK government wanted to sort of demonstrate its leadership on nutrition issues. So I was there leading the nutrition team at the time where there was all of that sort of political commitment. And I think having gone through that period, which I think to all intents and purposes was largely a big success. There are various critiques of it, but it delivered a lot more resources into the sector. And I think I was getting a little bit restless in terms of wanting to be a bit closer to the impact of what I was doing, because obviously a lot of that work in the international sphere is quite, I mean, you're traveling and visiting people, etc., and talking to lots of people, but it's still kind of very macro, a lot of it, and quite several steps removed from the real impact of what you're trying to achieve. So I wanted to be closer to the action. So that was either mean of moving to one of the country offices or whatever in DFID, which was going to be difficult on the practical home front, or thinking about something closer to home. And the Food Foundation didn't exist at that point. It was a brand new organization. And the thought of sort of leading something from its very beginning was appealing. I was sort of got that point of my career where that was like, it seemed like a huge challenge, but one that I was kind of up for. And so I took the leap. I mean, it was a huge leap because, I was in a good job in the civil service with all the support that goes with that, to a job with a sort of 18-month contract, a little bit of money for sort of two people, myself included, and a kind of organization to demonstrate that we were worth investing in and could deliver impact. So it was a hugely exciting challenge, which I have no regrets on at all. I absolutely loved every minute of it.
So tell me a little bit about, as you moved into this, looking at food policy solutions for low income communities in Britain, how did you approach that? What was some of the areas that you lent into?
All the work that I'd done in international development was very numbers heavy. If you think about all the work in nutrition, it's like, well, what's the level of undernutrition? How much stunting is there? How much wasting? It's all very numbers driven. And I came into the UK context and a lot of people were talking about food poverty, but there were no numbers. Nobody really knew anything about the scale of the problem. FAO was just starting to do its Voices of the Hungry work and starting to put some numbers on the UK. The first sort of real thing that we put our energy into campaigning for was for the government to start to track levels of food insecurity systematically. We explored that through various routes, and ultimately we got there. And the government now does measure food insecurity every year through its big family resources survey. It's 20,000 people who are surveyed across the country using standard methods, those recommended by the UN, which that was all a really kind of significant foundation for us. Now we can now use government statistics when we're talking about the problem. So that was a kind of the way into it. And then, of course, we quite quickly then got drawn into, well, what are the policy solutions? And then we got into much more trying to understand the picture for children. And we did a big national inquiry into children's food insecurity, which involved talking to a lot of children and young people who were from disadvantaged parts of the country about their lived experience. So we then started to sort of couple the more quantitative traditional forms of evidence with personal stories, which are unbelievably powerful. And that kind of coupling of evidence has actually stayed with us right through now. We have a group of 50 citizen ambassadors, some of whom are under the age of 18 and some are adults, who all bring those lived experiences to our work. They advise us. We try and give them a platform with government, with MPs and others, so that their voices can be heard. And they're like our sort of activist arm, if you like. When we do more kind of establishment sort of types of engagement, they are bringing their voices and really calling for action in very compelling ways.
And I know you've been resourcing them, and there's amazing sort of insights and learnings that you've been working with them from. At the moment, we're in this challenge around this living crisis and the cost of living. How are you seeing that impact the food space, and what's changing in that space over the time that you've been doing this?
Well, I mean, we've seen a dramatic rise in food insecurity for sure. I think there's sort of two steps to it, really. We had the COVID pandemic. When we realized just how fast moving that the context was going to be, we decided we would actually start measuring food insecurity ourselves, because the government data is always a year out of date because it's gathered on a massive scale, and it was going to be useless for actually working out what was happening as the pandemic kind of evolved. So we started that off, and we've been doing measurements every 6 months since then. So we've got a really good trend line for the last 5 years. And what we saw was a sort of a spike in food insecurity immediately at the point of the pandemic when everything was closed down. And then the situation improved and the government put in place a number of really important measures, like an uplift in the universal credit, the kind of basic benefit mechanism for people on a low income. There was a big furlough scheme for paid workers. There's a lot of protections in place. But what happened in that period was that there was suddenly, as people kind of experienced the pandemic, thought about their communities, and perhaps had time more to consider what was going on, there was a huge amount of public interest in food poverty, use of food banks, how people would actually get the food they needed to eat in the context of such a big crisis. And what we found was that pre-pandemic, trying to place a news story about levels of food insecurity in the UK, well, you could probably get The Guardian interested, but at the start of the pandemic, every newspaper was looking at everything we were doing and reporting on it. It suddenly became an issue of huge public concern. And in turn, that triggered Marcus Rashford, the now famous Manchester United footballer, to pick up on our data and start to campaign for the government to step up its commitments around children. So there was that step. And then, of course, we went into the cost of living crisis, which in terms of its impact on food insecurity was far, far greater than the pandemic. We saw the graph just climb. The rates doubled, basically, during 2022 and 2023. They've come down a little since then, but not very much, still at very high levels. And when you look at food prices, they've climbed. Okay, they've plateaued a bit now, but nothing's come down. We've still got this major mismatch between incomes and the cost of living. And it's affecting millions of people in Britain all the time at the moment. And of course, many of children who are living in those families who are exposed to the risks that brings. So, yeah, I mean, the food insecurity picture is extremely concerning. And we're concerned about is that because food inflation isn't top of the news agenda in the way that it was a year ago, that makes everybody think, oh, it's all okay again now. And that's not what the data's telling us.
So in thinking about the price side and then the challenges, you talked also about the inflation. What would you say is the biggest challenge facing Britain's food system?
If we're looking at food poverty, there's an income problem, which is sort of in some ways adjacent to rather than embedded in the food system. Though, of course, there are many big employers in the food system who don't pay their staff very well. Many of the big supermarkets, for example, have some of the lowest paid workers. So there is a connection there, but there's an income problem, and there's a lot of work going on to try and drive up minimum wage, but we need equal attention really on the social security system, which has been kind of raided in government budgetary terms over a number of years and is just threadbare really in terms of its ability to really provide a safety net. So there's that part of the problem. Then there's the kind of price issue where the cheapest food is the least nutritious. And so that's very much around the fiscal incentives in the system. At the moment, it's just much, much easier to make money from selling food that's really bad for you. And so that's how companies make money. And that's because of the incentives in the system. So there's a huge policy agenda there around how you shift those incentives so that it actually is easier to make money from selling nutritious foods, and in turn rebalance the prices between the least healthy and the healthier, more nourishing foods. Tied up within that, of course, is also the environmental piece of this story. And we've just published, the UK's published its 7th carbon budget, the Climate Change Committee, which proposes the next set of legally binding targets for decarbonisation. And the food system is increasingly becoming more visible in that narrative. And in fact, today they are talking about the need to reduce meat consumption alongside the other things that need to happen within agriculture to try and move farmers to more nature friendly and more lower carbon methods of producing food. And many of the food companies are, they've got their scope 3 targets and they're way off track, and they're trying to work out how to move their sales in favor of lower carbon foods. But the same challenges remain, like unless the foods which are environmentally friendly and nutritious are the most affordable, the most appealing, and the most widely available, you won't get the dietary shift that you need. And so looking at those food environments in the system and how they enable those shifts to happen is where the energy needs to be spent in policy terms.
So in aligning that environmental sustainability with the nutrition policy, what do you think are the things that you would be asking for? Like what are the win-wins?
Beans, maybe?
That's amazing. That was not a paid comment. That was just amazing that you came to that. That was a good question.
Very good question. And what's also great about beans, not only health and environment, but also it ticks a bit of a box on affordable, particularly when compared to the cost of meat.
So you're seeing these kinds of foods as solutions, I guess, to increase and try and drive forward.
Yeah, exactly. So we want to work with both the policymakers, the businesses, and direct to citizens. So there's a kind of an appeal piece, which I think is aimed at citizens, which is how do we make these foods like super fun and exciting and delicious? And then there's a policy enabling piece, and what are the businesses going to do? What do they need to do within their ranges? What do they need to do on menu with NPD, with all the stuff that they can do in store, a whole raft of things. So yeah, lots of opportunity. And I think one that you'll know that, as soon as you start talking about beans, it's like a sort of magnet. People go, yes, let's get involved. And it all feels very exciting. So we're at that stage in the UK, as you know, where people are kind of crowding in around the idea, and we're trying to work out exactly where we put our first sort of stage of investment to deliver a bit of a step change in terms of consumption of beans, legumes and pulses.
London has a food board. And what role do you think they play in shaping the future of food and food policy in the city?
Well, the London Food Board have been, I was on it for a little while. They've been quite influential in terms of shaping the mayor's approach to food. And obviously, there have been two really big food commitments which the London mayor has made, where it's sort of set London ahead of the national picture. So one is around banning the advertising of junk food on the Transport for London estate, which is obviously a huge rail network in London. So they took the step to do that. Some other mayors are now following suit with that, which is great. And then expanding free school meals to all primary school children in London, which again was a really bold move by Sadiq Khan, and one that I think has served him very well politically as well, actually. But again, it kind of puts London ahead of everywhere else and means around in the rest of England, we've still got children going to school, living below the poverty line, not eligible for free school meals and eating incredibly badly in schools. So the London Food Board is great. And what of course it does is it helps the GLA, the Greater London Authority, to bring together across its various departments its sort of food focus within a kind of coherent framework, and draws in support from the business and civil society community in that effort. London's a little unusual because you've got obviously the boroughs is where a lot of the real delivery happens, but the GLA has a really important sort of enabling role.
And I guess leadership role in terms of really setting that broad agenda and those broader initiatives for others to come around. So obviously you've just talked a little bit about beans. What initiatives are you most excited about at the Food Foundation at the moment?
Well, I am very excited about beans, but aside from beans, we've also got a food strategy which the government has announced just before Christmas. We're talking a lot at the moment to DEFRA, the lead department, though the government does intend to make this a very cross-governmental effort. We're excited about it because people may have followed that we have had a bit of a stop-start situation with food strategies in the UK. We had an independent review, which was led by a man called Henry Dimbleby, that published in 2022, commissioned by government, but as an independent review, it's a set of recommendations to government. And the government's response to it was appalling, largely because the UK, as people will know, has been in waves of political turmoil for some time until the general election of this year. So nothing much happened, but we've got a brilliant sort of set of recommendations, a diagnosis of what's going wrong with the food system in Henry's report. And so now to have the new government pick up so quickly, actually, I think we were surprised at how quickly it's actually come out as being a DEFRA priority, taking on this agenda, not skipping the step of diagnosis and getting straight into working out what recommendations it wants to pursue, I think is really exciting. It comes at an interesting time as well, because everyone's talking a bit more now about national food security, not least in the context of geopolitical changes globally, but also, of course, climate change affecting farmers and production in the UK, as well as from the places where we import food. So there's a kind of food security backdrop to it, but also a massive public health crisis, which demand on the NHS being driven by very poor diets in the UK. And of course, net zero and the need to keep on track with carbon reduction. So we're very excited about that. The government has also initiated a child poverty task force, which we're engaging very heavily with. We want to try and get them to commit to expand free school meals. We're doing a lot of work on that with MPs and others. So there are some exciting opportunities at the moment in the policy sphere. I hope that in a year's time, we'll start to actually see some real commitments.
Well, one question that I like to kind of ask everyone on this show, and it's kind of as we come to a close, is what's something that you're enjoying eating at the moment?
Well, am I not allowed to say beans, am I? Because that's all a bit like repeat.
You can say beans. You can say beans. But I want to get specific. What do you mean? What type of beans? How do you like cooking them? What's your favorite way?
Well, I don't really want to do a big advert, but I have been eating we've just had relatively, I think, newly on the market here in the UK is proper jarred beans in jars. They're produced by a company called Bold Beans here. And we have been doing a lot of meals with them.
The big butter bean or the bolotti?
There's a butter bean, there's a cannellini bean, a butter bean, and there's also a UK grown Carlin pea, which is like a black chickpea kind of a thing, which is also delicious. So that has been a particular passion. And I think I've eaten more beans in the last 3 months than I've eaten probably the last 3 years. It's like, but very much enjoying them.
It's good to hear. No, it's, people have all these issues with beans, but then when they start, it's good to see.
Well, and the taste of these jarred ones does seem to really, I mean, I think if you soak them, you get the same outcome, but I'm very lazy. But the jars and the broth that they're in is delicious.
You're loving it. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this show, and really exciting to hear about the work that you're doing and also some of the things on the horizon, and really great to see the hope there, I guess, on real impact, because in our world at the moment, there's a definite need for that.
Absolutely. Well, great to chat. Thank you.
You've been listening to Future Fork, a show that explores the world of food and the decisions we can make today that will shape our future. Future Fork is produced by Disruptive Consulting Solutions and supports the SDG2 Advocacy Hub. For more info, head to the website futureforkpodcast.com. This show was produced with strategy and production support from Wavelength Creative. So you don't miss an episode of Future Fork, make sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your podcast app. And while you're there, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others find the show. I'm Paul Newnham, and I'll see you in the next episode.